Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We are currently reading Manitou Blood by Graham Masterton. And this week we are beginning Chapter 13. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy the story. Chapter 13, Blood Hunt. Frank couldn't stop shivering. The thermostat on his air conditioning unit said that it was 94 degrees in his bedroom, and he was basted in sweat, but he felt chilled to the very core, as if his skeleton had been taken out of his body and stored in the freezer overnight, and then put back. Even his teeth felt as if they were frozen. He didn't know what time it was, but he knew that something nightmarish had happened. Every time he swallowed, he could taste metal, and the roof of his mouth felt as if it were thickly coated in congealed fat. He had a jumbled memory of somebody shouting, and blood, and struggling, but his brain refused to focus on it in any detail. It occurred to him that he might have been involved in a serious accident, and that he was suffering from shock. It didn't occur to him that he was dying. He tried to sit up. After 2 attempts, he managed to prop himself up on one elbow. It was then that he saw Susan Fireman sitting on the end of his bed, watching him. It was still dark outside, although the city sounded much quieter than it had before. No helicopters, and only an occasional siren. "I feel cold," he croaked. Susan Fireman stood up and moved around the bed with a strange, gliding walk. She looked down at him, and she was smiling. "It won't be long now," she told him. "You took care of me, and now I'm taking care of you." "I feel so cold. Why do I feel so cold?" "You won't feel cold for much longer, Frank." He lay back down on the bed. "What's happening to me?" he asked her. She stroked his sweat-beaded forehead with her fingertips and then sucked them, one after the other. "The greatest adventure that can happen to anyone." "I don't understand." "You will, Frank, once you pass over. It will all become shining clear to you, as if the moon has come up." "The moon?" "Of course. You can never see the sun again." Frank slept and dreamed that he was running through the dunes at Hyannis, on Cape Cod, where he used to live when he was a boy. The wind was fluffing in his ears, and the long grass was whipping his legs. In his dream, he was aware that something was badly wrong, but he didn't know what. He turned his head to see if anybody was running after him, but there was nobody there, only the dunes and the clouds and the slowly circling seagulls. The sky was so blue that it was almost black, like night. As he climbed the dunes toward the roadway, he saw a dazzling flash of light. It flashed again, and it was so bright that he had to lift his hand to shield his eyes. He struggled up through the deep, soft sand until he reached a white picket fence. An old black Mercury Marquis was parked about 50 yards away, its side panels smeary with wax. It looked at first like the same car that had once belonged to his grandfather. But then he realized that it had been converted into a hearse, and that there was a gray metal casket lying in the back. His grandfather, Stefan, was sitting in the driver's seat, his white hair combed so that it was shining like a halo. He was staring out toward the ocean. Not far away from the front of the car stood Susan Fireman. She was naked except for a strange hat that looked as if it had been folded out of stiff black paper. Beside her was the cheval mirror that usually stood in the corner of his bedroom, and she was deliberately angling it into his eyes. He reached the tarmac and started to walk toward her. The sand crunched under his shoes. "What are you doing here?" he shouted at her, although his voice sounded flat and muffled, as if he were shouting into a metal bucket. She didn't answer, so he walked right up to her. She lifted her head and smiled at him, and both of her eyes were totally crimson. "What happened?" he asked her. "You can't go out in the sun any more," said Susan Fireman. "I thought you would like to see its reflection, to remember it by." Frank turned around. Behind him, it was night-time. The sky was dark, and the ocean was nothing but a thin, phosphorescent line of foam. Inside the cheval mirror, however, it was still daylight, and the sun was shining on the sand. "What's happening?" Frank repeated. "Don't you know, Frank? You're passing over. The sun will be coming up soon. Why don't you step inside the looking-glass where it's bright? You can be safe there until it's dark." "What do you mean, step inside the looking-glass?" "A looking-glass is a door, Frank. It's not a wall. A looking-glass is a way through." "I can't step inside. It's impossible." "Come on, Frank. You're one of the pale people now. You can do anything you want. Climb walls, step into mirrors." Susan Fireman walked around so that she was facing the mirror. She turned to look at Frank, and then she stepped straight into the glass so that she joined up with her own reflection, like two brightly colored shapes in a kaleidoscope. The next thing Frank knew, she was standing inside the mirror, in the sunshine, and she was no longer beside him in the dark. She laughed, and he could hear her, but she sounded as if she were laughing on the other side of a closed window. Alarmed, he looked around. The wind was rising, and he was alone. His grandfather had gone, too. The black hearse stood empty, its chrome spotted with rust and its windows all milky. "Come on, Frank," said Susan Fireman. "It only takes a single step." "I'm not coming," he told her. "You have to, Frank. You don't have any choice." "I told you I'm not coming." It was then that he saw something on the shoreline, about a half-mile behind Susan Fireman, right at the ocean's edge. It was tall and dark and angular, and it was striding toward her. It reminded him of the mirage in Lawrence of Arabia, the black-robed Arab gradually approaching Lawrence across the desert, except that it was so stretched out and disproportionate that it looked more like an ungainly combination of horse and man, or something else altogether, something totally monstrous. As it came nearer, he saw that it was the same creature that he had encountered in the storeroom at the Sisters of Jerusalem. He saw its face, first leaning one way and then the other, and its eyes, constantly shifting and changing, from the stone eyes of a garden statue to the glassy amber eyes of a tiger-skin rug. It approached Susan Fireman at extraordinary speed, growing larger and larger, and as it came nearer, a high trail of sand was whipped up behind it and whirled away by the wind. "Hurry up, Frank," Susan Fireman urged him. "He'll come after you anyhow, whatever you do." Frank turned around. He thought about running, but he knew that he was dreaming and that he could never run fast in dreams. The dark, attenuated creature was so close now that it would probably catch him before he could reach the dunes. There was only one thing he could do. He took 3 steps back and picked up a broken brick from the parking lot wall. Gripping it tight, he walked right up to the mirror and hit it, hard, right where Susan Fireman's face was. The mirror cracked from side to side, but he smashed again and again and again, until there was nothing but a glittering heap of glass and an empty oval frame. He dropped the brick and stood back. He was so cold that he could barely think, but he felt that he had saved himself, at least for now. He was still standing there when the moon rose and shone through the empty oval frame like the face of a long-dead friend. He opened his eyes. His bedroom was filled with blurry sunlight. He lay staring at the wall for a very long time, feeling so cold that he was unable to move. If he moved, he felt that his knees and elbows would probably break, and his finger bones would crackle. But at least he was sure that he wasn't dead. Eventually, the sun inched its way across the lower part of the bed. It burned his toes, blistering the skin and actually sending up wisps of smoke, but at least his feet felt warmer. He knew now that everything that had happened to him was real. Susan Fireman, the blood-drinking epidemic, the morgue filled with corpses, the people in winding sheets climbing out of the hospital window and over the rooftops, the dark, angular figure with eyes that changed from glass to stone. It had really happened, and it had happened to him. It was then that he remembered last night's dream, the beach at Hyannis, and the shattered mirror. Slowly, with a grunt of pain, he managed to lift up his head and look toward the far corner of the room. General Grant's cheval mirror was nothing but an empty oval frame, with a heap of sparkling fragments all around it. Close to the wall lay a heavy black onyx box that Christina had given him for his 32nd birthday, the only gift that he had ever liked. He shifted himself around so that he could see through the open doorway into the corridor. At first, he couldn't understand what he was looking at, but then he realized that somebody was sprawled on the carpet. He could see a pair of shiny black shoes, and a pair of legs, dark-trousered, and a hand with a heavy signet ring on it. He lifted his head a little more and saw that it was Lieutenant Roberts, whose blood he had swallowed, warm and thick, directly out of the spouting wound in his neck. "Oh, my God," he choked. The sudden recollection of it made his stomach muscles cramp up, and he retched again and again until his throat was so sore that he couldn't retch any more. His head dropped back, and he lay on the bed for almost another hour, exhausted and feverish. Then he thought to himself, "I have to get up. I have to get up out of here. I have to find help." Otherwise, another day would pass by and darkness would return, and he didn't have any doubt that Susan Fireman would be coming back for him. And she would bring that angular shadow creature too, whatever that was. Slowly and painfully, like a man twice his age, Frank managed to sit up and ease his legs off the bed. His bed was like some grotesque piece of modern art. The sheets were covered in hardened blood and twisted into strange shapes, like tortured faces. He gripped the head of the bed and pulled himself up so that he was standing. For a moment, he felt as if all the blood had dropped out of his head, and he was going to faint. But he took 5 or 6 very deep breaths and steadied himself. He walked stiffly out of the bedroom, stepping over Lieutenant Roberts' body on the floor. The wound in Lieutenant Roberts' neck was gaping so wide that Frank could see into his open windpipe. Lieutenant Roberts was staring at nothing at all, and his face was gray, as if he had been dusted with ash from a crematorium. Frank looked down at him and said, "Sorry, pal. Rest in peace." He didn't know what Lieutenant Roberts' religion had been, and he couldn't think of what else to say. Further along the corridor, on his back, lay Detective Mancini. His eyes were closed, but he still looked terrified. His arms and legs were sticking out at awkward angles, and his mouth was caught in mid-gag, as if he were choking on a fishbone. His neck was cut wide open, too, like Lieutenant Roberts', and it was obvious from the pallor of his face that he had been exsanguinated. There were only a few brown squiggles of blood on the carpet, so Frank guessed that Susan Fireman had drunk the rest of it. The thought of that made him feel nauseated again. He walked through to the kitchen and hung over the sink and vomited lumps of half-digested blood. It was black, like raw liver, and it slid down the drain as if it had a life of its own. He hunched there for almost 5 minutes, his stomach muscles clenching and unclenching, but at last he managed to straighten himself up, tear off a sheet of paper towel, and wipe his mouth. My God, he thought, physician, heal thyself. He didn't want to die, especially if it meant that he was going to be reincarnated like Susan Fireman or any of the other people who were roaming the city, thirsty for human blood. He knew he was very sick, but if this was an illness, there had to be a cure for it. He dragged out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. His tongue felt as if it had been sandpapered, and he desperately needed a drink, but even the thought of running water gave him the dry heaves. The death troll was wrong. This disease wasn't at all like hemorrhagic Dengue fever. It was much more like rabies. And just like rabies, it started with irritability and feverishness, and soon afterward, the sufferer started to have nightmares and irrational terrors. Just like rabies, it was characterized by an irrational dread of water, which was why rabies was often called hydrophobia. Unlike rabies, however, this disease didn't seem to be transmitted by animal bites or by bites of any kind. If Frank's own experience was anything to go by, it was communicated through the exchange of bodily fluids, like HIV. He didn't know how Susan Fireman had persuaded him to have sex with her. His memory of it was nothing but a jumble of pornographic images, but she had done it somehow. One thing was plain. Once they were infected, victims quickly began to feel an unbearable burning sensation all over their skin surface and a raging thirst for human blood. They also showed symptoms that violent and radical changes were taking place in their metabolism. They became pale people, so highly charged with adrenaline that they could climb near vertical walls and contort their bodies, as Susan Fireman had done, into near impossible knots. They started to have suffocating nightmares of being shut up in boxes and speak in foreign languages, although Frank couldn't even begin to understand how this could happen. Although their thirst for human blood was so overwhelming, it was obvious that the pale people couldn't digest it in any great quantities, which led them to vomit most of it back up again. But once they had died, or passed over, as Susan Fireman had called it, they seemed to be able to drink copious amounts of blood and keep it down. Frank looked down at his hands. His skin was burning so painfully that he had to curl his fingers, and he bit his lips to stop himself from sobbing out loud. But he knew that sobbing wouldn't do him any good. He needed to think. He was a doctor. He needed to find out where this disease had originated and how it was being spread so rapidly. He needed to find out how to cure himself before he passed over, too. And then he had to work out a way to inoculate the rest of the city's population. Before he did anything, he knew that he had to accept one impossible fact. People who were infected by this disease could walk and talk after they had appeared to be clinically dead. Susan Fireman had died, and yet she had managed to climb into his apartment and kill Lieutenant Roberts and Detective Mancini. Already the city streets must be crowded with people like her, dead people, or technically dead people, walking. He searched his apartment room by room. He opened cupboard doors and even checked under the sink. There was no sign of Susan Fireman anywhere, so she must have left. But what had she asked him in his dream? "Why don't you step inside the looking glass? You can be safe there." He went back to the hallway. It suddenly came back to him now. Susan Fireman had been standing inside the mirror, not her reflection, her, behind the glass. Detective Mancini had backed toward her, and she had reached out of the mirror and cut his throat. Frank stepped over Lieutenant Roberts again. There were bloody smudges all over the carpet in every direction. The pile was too thick for them to be clearly identified as footprints, except in the bedroom, around the spot where Susan Fireman had actually cut Lieutenant Roberts' throat. Here there was a huge dark patch of blood that was still wet, and small bare footprints crisscrossing right through it. On one side, however, the footprints headed directly toward the cheval mirror. There they finished. Shaking with pain, Frank knelt down on the carpet and carefully picked up a handful of shattered glass. At least 2 of Susan Fireman's footprints were underneath the glass, so the mirror must have been smashed after she walked up to it. But there were no footprints heading away from it, so maybe his dream hadn't all been illusory. Maybe Susan Fireman had stepped into the cheval mirror, and maybe she had beckoned him to follow her inside, and maybe the half-brick hadn't been a half-brick, but his onyx box. He suddenly thought to himself, vampires can't survive in sunlight, can they? Not in the legends, at least. That's why they return to their coffins when dawn breaks. But what if they can't find coffins to hide in, or seamlessly dark places? Where do they go? It seemed impossible, but maybe there was a hiding place for vampires, a hiding place that was always bright, but which no light could ever penetrate. The world of mirrors. Frank went into the kitchen, opening the cutlery drawer, and took out the hammer that he used for flattening steaks. Then he walked around the whole apartment, smashing every single mirror, even the shaving mirror in the bathroom. Maybe he was losing his mind, but mirrors could be replaced, and if he was right, he might have found a way to protect himself from Susan Fireman and her shadow creature. If they hid inside mirrors during daylight hours, then breaking mirrors was as good as bricking up doors. He looked at the square black Italian clock in the living room. It was 7:37 in the morning. He needed to get back to the Sisters of Jerusalem and tell the death toll what he had discovered. He was sure that if the hospital's pathology team knew what they were really up against, they could isolate the cause of this epidemic much more quickly. He lifted one arm and sniffed. He stank of blood and stale sweat. But he couldn't face the idea of taking a shower. Instead, he went back to the bathroom and pulled down the blind. Then he took off all of his clothes and carefully wiped himself all over with a face cloth soaked in Dolce & Gabbana aftershave. Face, neck, chest, and underarms. He winced when he wiped the scratches on his body, but he needed to feel clean and sterilized all over. When he was finished cleaning himself, he smothered his face with a thick layer of sunscreen, Factor 30, which he had bought for his skiing vacation last year in Vail. Then he dressed in a pair of black jeans and a black turtleneck sweater and gloves. Finally, he pulled a black ski hood over his head and put on a pair of Ray-Bans. He looked like the Invisible Man. Before he opened his front door, he stood with his hand pressed against it, breathing deeply to control his pain. His skin was on fire, and his thirst for blood was so fierce that he felt like one of the addicts who were brought into the Sisters of Jerusalem, quaking with need, all of their humanity lost to their addiction. They would kill for drugs, most of those addicts, and he was sorely tempted to forget about the Sisters of Jerusalem and do the same. Total nostru, he whispered, carelli esti in serrari. The sun blinded him as he came down the front steps of his house, even though he was wearing dark glasses. He hadn't imagined how much the sun would burn him, even through his clothes, and he let out a staccato cry of agony that was almost a laugh. But he managed to cross the street into the shadow of the houses opposite, and he found that if he kept himself out of direct sunlight, the burning was nearly bearable. "Total nostru," he repeated, "Corelli esti insurari." For some reason, the words gave him hope that everything was going to turn out for the better, and that his agony would soon be over. Murray Hill was deserted. In the distance, uptown, Frank thought that he could see people hurrying down 3rd Avenue and the sharp glint of an automobile window, and from over on the west side he could hear the walk, walk, walk of police sirens. But here, midtown, the streets were almost completely silent, and there seemed to be nobody left alive. A burned-out Lexus lay halfway across the street, and 2 or 3 blocks away, Frank thought he could see bodies lying on the sidewalk, surrounded by squabbling crows. But the glare of the sun was too bright for him to see how many there were. "Total nostru," he whispered. He hurried across 3rd Avenue and Lexington and Park. He felt as if he were the only person in New York City left alive. Up above him, the sky was cloudless, except for a few streaks of mares' tails toward the northwest. Some of the debris that was lying in the streets was so strange that he couldn't imagine who had left it there, or why. On Lexington, a grand piano was standing in the middle of the road, and on Park he came across piles of men's tuxedos strewn across the sidewalk. It looked as if an orchestra had been attacked by marauding Indians, and this was all that was left. By the time he reached 5th Avenue, he was close to collapse. His legs were blistering underneath his jeans, and his lips felt as if he had kissed a hot electric iron. Maybe he should turn back. Maybe he should try to find somebody whose blood he could drink. A down and out, maybe. Somebody whose death wouldn't really matter. After all, he was much more important than some bum, wasn't he? If he were to die, nobody would find out the truth about the epidemic, and thousands more people would be killed. By the time he reached 33rd Street, he had almost persuaded himself to go in search of a victim whose throat he could cut. But as he hurried around the corner, he was suddenly faced by 2 police cars and 6 or 7 police officers with dogs and riot shields. "Stop!" shouted one of the cops. "Hit the sidewalk, face down!" Frank didn't hesitate. He turned and ran. He knew what would happen if they caught him. They would take off his sunglasses and his hood, and the sunlight would incinerate him right in front of them. That's if they didn't shoot him first. He ran and kept on running, dodging from one street to the next and cutting through alleys whenever he could. He heard one of the police cars coming after him, its tires squealing as it slid around the corner. He even glimpsed it momentarily as it flashed across 28th Street, but he dodged into the doorway of a dry cleaner's and stayed there, gasping for breath, until he was sure that it wasn't going to come doubling back. "Total nostru," he panted. Smoke was pouring out of his sleeves. "Total nostru, no dose prenue in ispita. But deliver us from evil. Amen." Then he started running again. For a while, a mongrel ran alongside him, barking, but when he reached Washington Square, it caught sight of another dog and tore off after it between the trees. He slowed to a walk. He was burning so badly now that he hardly cared if they caught him. Maybe he should allow himself to die so that he could join Susan Fireman in the world of mirrors and absolute darkness. Anything had to be better than this. Even if he could help to isolate an antidote, there was no guarantee that he was going to be able to cure himself. He stumbled on, crossing street after street. He had completely lost his sense of direction. He didn't know where the Sisters of Jerusalem was, and he no longer cared. He just wanted the pain to stop. Halfway across Barrow Street, he dropped to his knees. He stayed there, with his head lowered, trying to summon up the strength to carry on. "Our Father, which art nowhere to be found, please rescue me." Gradually, however, he became aware that somebody was standing in front of him. He looked up slowly and saw a muscular young man in a khaki t-shirt and Desert Storm pants. The man was holding a pickaxe handle in one hand, which he kept slapping into the palm of his other hand. "Don't think you're coming any further, fella," the young man told him flatly. Frank coughed and spat out blood. "I don't think I could come any further if I tried. This area is off limits to bloodsuckers. Maybe your problem isn't your fault, but we don't want you around here, so I suggest you turn around and stagger back the way you came." "I'm a doctor," said Frank. "What?" "I'm a doctor. I've caught the virus, but I haven't cut anybody's throat, and with any luck, I won't have to." He tried again to climb to his feet, but the young man jabbed him in the breastbone with his pickaxe handle so that he dropped back onto his knees. "You stay away from me, man. You hear me? You stay well away. I don't want to catch that thing too." "I don't think that's very likely," said Frank. "It's a sexual disease. It gets passed from person to person through the exchange of bodily fluids." "You mean like AIDS?" "Exactly like AIDS." "So how do you know that?" "Because I'm a doctor, and because that's the way I caught it." "Through having sex?" "That's right, through having sex. Now I'm trying to get back to the Sisters of Jerusalem. I can't call them because all the phone lines are dead, and my cell phone won't work, and my computer server's down too, but they need to know what I've discovered." "If you're trying to get to the Sisters of Jerusalem, man, you're way off. Do you know where you are?" Frank looked around. His eyes were blinded by the sun, and his head was throbbing so hard that he could barely think. "I don't know. 7th Avenue? In the 20s? "Oh, man, you're way down in West Village, Hudson Street, at Barrow." Frank managed to get up on one knee. "I have to get to the Sisters of Jerusalem." "I don't care where you have to get to, buddy, so long as you turn yourself around and head back exactly where you came from." "But nobody else understands. They're vampires. That's what they are. Not just ordinary people sucking blood. They're real, genuine vampires. They call themselves strigoi." The young man stared at him acutely. "Did you just say what I thought you just said?" Frank felt confused. His head was throbbing more painfully than ever, and he was sure that he could smell his body hair burning. "What? I don't know what I just said." "You said strigoi. You know about strigoi?" "Well, no, not very much, but I know that's what they are, and I know where they hide when the sun comes up. At least, I'm pretty sure I do, and I think I know how to stop them coming back when it gets dark." "But you're one of them." "No, I'm not yet, anyway. I've been infected, yes, but I haven't passed over." The young man didn't seem to know what to do. He looked left and right, and then he said, "You can't go back to the Sisters of Jerusalem." "Why not?" "There's no point. The last I heard, the place was overrun, and it was on fire." "Well, I still need to find somebody in charge, somebody from the City Health Authority or the CDC." "I don't know, man. The whole damn city's turned into a nut house." Frank coughed up more blood. The young man watched him for a while, and then he said, "Listen, I met this guy, and he knows something about these strigoi, too. I think the best thing you can do right now is come to meet him." "You're sure?" "Well, not really, but what else am I going to do?" Frank looked up at him, shielding his eyes with his hand. You may as well know that I have a raging thirst for human blood. I can't pretend that I don't. My skin feels like it's on fire, and if you take me with you, then I can't give you any guarantees that I'm not going to cut your throat and drink your blood." "What's your name?" the young man asked him. "Frank Winter, M.D. "Well, Doc, my name's Gil Johnson, and I'm a National Guardsman with the Rainbow Division, and if you even look at my throat, I'm going to take this pickaxe handle, and I'm going to beat your brains into raspberry jello." Very unsteadily, Frank stood up. "Believe me, Gil, that would probably be a blessed relief." Chapter 14. Blood of Dracula. Jenica poured us 2 glasses of sweet, white Romanian wine and offered me a plate of almond biscuits that tasted like very fine sand. She sat next to me on the velvet-upholstered couch, close enough for our knees to keep touching. My father telephoned me from Bucharest as soon as he heard what was happening in New York. His very first word was Strigoi. I coughed on my biscuit. Singing Rock specifically warned me not to say that name out loud, in case they heard me saying it and came after me. He said they would tear me to pieces. No, Jenica reassured me. The word Strigoi alone is not enough to alert them. Strigoi is just general name for vampires, not any special vampire. Your spirit guide was warning you, yes, but he must have told you another name, too, a special name. I shook my head. If he did, I didn't pick up on it. Well, if he has not told you yet, he will very soon, Jenica assured me. If so many Strigoi are suddenly loose in New York, they must have come from a nest. I don't follow you. A nest is many Strigoi who are hiding together, or perhaps sealed up by vampire hunters. Sometimes they remain concealed for centuries, waiting to escape. My father studied Strigoi when he was in Romania, at the university. He was always convinced right from the beginning that there was a nest hidden someplace in New York. He has searched for it for many years, ever since he first came to America. He has visited many libraries and studied many old maps and diaries, but he could never locate them. Jenica took hold of my hand and began to emphasize what she meant by tracing patterns on my palm, a sensation that was very exciting. A nest of Strigoi will always be guided and controlled by a very powerful vampire spirit, one of the Svarkolaki. In English, I suppose you would translate one of the Svarkolaki as a dead vampire. He does not inhabit his physical body anymore, like one of the Strigoi, who are the undead. He is what you would call a ghost, or a wandering soul. Svarkolaki? I never heard of Svarkolaki. Mind you, I never heard of Strigoi either before today. In Romanian folk stories, another name for one of the Svarkolaki is vampire gatherer. Once the Strigoi from the nest have infected people, the vampire gatherer goes out searching for them and leads them back to the nest. There he teaches them the ways of the night, so that they become Strigoi too. I am sure that it was one of the Svarkolaki that your spirit guide was warning you about, because a vampire gatherer can hear his name called at any distance, even in a whisper. Even if you say it in your dreams. Sometimes you only have to think his name, and he will prick up his ears and come after you. So, what are they like, these vampire gatherers? They take many different shapes, Mr. Harry, and many different faces, but mostly people call them the slanting ones, because they always appear like shadows, leaning away from any source of light. I will show you. Jenica walked across the living room and brought back a small red leather-bound book from one of the shelves. She opened it up and handed it to me. The text was all in Romanian, but the engraved illustration didn't need any translation. It showed two small children sleeping in a wooden bed with a guttering candle on their bedside table. Above them stood a sloping, dark, impossibly stretched-out figure, exactly like the figure that had appeared in my apartment when I was reading Ted Bush's Fortune. I felt a chilly, sinking sensation in my stomach, the feeling you get when you know that things are going badly wrong and there's nothing that you can do but sit and wait for the worst to happen. "I've seen him," I told Jenica, handing the book back. "I've seen this sucker for real. Singing Rock showed him to me in my apartment. This is him, or something very much like him." "Then now we are absolutely sure what we are dealing with," said Jenica. She studied the picture for a moment, and then she closed the book tightly and put it down on the table, with a heavy glass paperweight on top of it, as if the vampire gatherer might find a way to escape from between the pages. "There are many Svarkolaki, and I think my father knows them all, but of course I cannot contact my father yet, until the phones are back." "But your father really believes that there's a nest of Strigoi here in New York?" "He is completely sure. He found some letters from the 19th century and also some bills of lading from a shipping company. Some of the letters were written in a kind of code, but it was not a difficult code to break." She poured me another glass of wine. I didn't really want one, especially since it tasted like sweaty leather watch bands, but it was well past 2 o'clock in the morning, and even though I felt exhausted and bruised and more than ready for bed, my brain was still jumping. Maybe the wine would act as a sedative, and maybe it would stop me from dreaming, too. Believe me, the last thing I wanted to do tonight was dream. Jenica said, "In 1869, two of the richest men in New York were Charles Redding from New England and George Vlad from Cluj-Napoca in Romania." "Sure, I've heard of them. Well, Charles Redding anyhow. He founded Redding's department store, didn't he? And he built some incredible Greek-style mansion right next door to the Astors on Fifth Avenue." "That's right. Charles Redding and George Vlad were business partners. Together they made millions of dollars by importing luxury goods from Europe and the Middle East, women's fashions and furniture and carpets and glassware. Charles Redding was satisfied to stay in New York, but George Vlad believed that they would become 100 times richer if they opened department stores all over America, first in Denver, in Colorado, and then others in California. He traveled to Denver and found a site for a new store, and then he sent back to New York for his wife and his 6 young children to join him. On their way across the plains, though, his family was attacked by a war party of Teton Sioux, and all of them were tortured and killed, even his newly born baby. Vlad swore an oath in front of God that he would have his revenge on the Indians, and that he would wipe out the Sioux, men, women, and children, just as they had wiped his family out. He took his family's remains back to Romania and arranged a traditional funeral, but my father discovered that he arranged something else, too. He went to a village near Borsa in Transylvania and arranged to take 200 coffins from the vaults of the local churches, where they had been sealed since 1767 for safekeeping. According to the letters that my father found, these coffins contained Strigoi, the undead, as well as a special iron sarcophagus containing one of the Svarkolaki. George Vlad's intention was to ship them to America and then to have them carried to Sioux territory, where he would revive them, and they would exterminate every single Sioux they could find. "Wow," I said. That was a hell of a plan. But even in those days, how did he think that he was going to get away with it? I mean, anybody who wanted to cart 200 dead bodies into Indian country wouldn't exactly have been inconspicuous, would he? Well, of course, but there is some documentary evidence that Georges Vlad was actually given support by the U.S. military and even an offer of wagons. The army saw it as an opportunity to defeat one of the most warlike of all the Indian tribes without having to risk any casualties among their own troops. But letting all those Strigoi loose, that was a pretty risky idea, don't you think? Once they'd wiped out the Indians, who were they going to feed on then? They would still have been looking for a regular diet of human blood, wouldn't they? I don't know for certain, Jenica admitted. Maybe Georges Vlad had thought of what he was going to do with all of those Strigoi once he had taken his revenge. Maybe he hadn't. But you have to understand that he would have had very strong control over them through the vampire gatherer. The vampire gatherer is a dead vampire, remember? He would not have been able to come back to life until Georges Vlad had performed the appropriate rituals to revive him. And once he was revived, he would have had to obey Georges Vlad's wishes, whatever they were. It is like the story from the Arabian Nights of the genie and the lamp. Whoever revives the vampire gatherer controls the vampires. But Georges Vlad didn't wipe out the Sioux, did he? I mean, the U.S. Army did it in the end. Well, you are right. The ship carrying the coffins arrived safely in New York Harbor. My father found a written record of that. Unfortunately for him, Georges Vlad died of a stroke an hour before the ship docked. So here were all these coffins in the ship's hold, but nobody knew what was in them or why they had been shipped all the way from Romania. Apart, that is, from the clerics in Borsa, in Romania, and 2 or 3 senior officers in the U.S. Army. Once Georges Vlad was dead, of course, nobody from the army was going to come forward to requisition the coffins. Even if any of their officers had known how to revive the Strigoi, which they didn't, somebody in authority would have asked what they wanted them for, and they wouldn't have been prepared to admit that they were planning on genocide. So what happened to the coffins? Charles Redding ordered them to be stored in the basement of Redding's department store until he could find out why his partner had brought them across the Atlantic. He thought that maybe they were the remains of Georges Vlad's relatives, and that Vlad had wanted them all to be buried in America, where he could pay his respects to them and tend their graves. He sent letters of inquiry to Bucharest, but he never received any replies, and only 5 months later, in the winter of 1871, he himself died of pneumonia. Redding's department store almost went bankrupt after his death, and it was bought by Green's and then by Bloomberg's, and nobody knows what happened to the coffins. Presumably, they were bricked up and buried in the foundations when Redding's department store was demolished in 1907. But now it looks like they've showed up? Yes, my father and I, we both believe that these Strigoi have come from Georges Vlad's nest. But there is a big question. Who has revived them? They must have been discovered by somebody who knew how to bring the vampire gatherer back to life. Well, there can't be many people who would know how to do that. Of course, but we have no idea who it is. Somebody who knows old Romanian legends, perhaps. So what's the plan? I don't know. If we want to stop this epidemic, we have to find out where is the nest, and where is the vampire gatherer, and who has revived him. And why he revived them, surely. I mean, whoever knew how to do it, they must have had some idea of what the consequences would be. Of course. So we are looking perhaps for a terrorist, or maybe somebody worse than a terrorist, a complete madman, maybe. Well, that's encouraging. I tried my cell phone again, but it was still dead. I listened, but for now the city seemed to be weirdly silent. No sirens, no helicopters, no traffic. "Do you want to come to bed?" asked Jenica. "Excuse me?" "You can sleep in my father's bed if you wish. There is nothing more we can do tonight." "Oh, right. Okay, that would be great. And I could really use a toothbrush if you have one. My mouth feels like I've been French kissing an armadillo." Jenica smiled. "That is Romanian wine. They say it gives a man such breath that he can knock down a house made of brick." I was woken up by somebody touching my shoulder. I thought it was Karen at first, and I batted her away. "Sleep," I protested. "Mr. Harry, I have brought you tea." I opened one eye and tried to focus. Jenica was standing over me, wearing a silky fuchsia-pink robe, very loosely tied. I lifted my head and looked around and realized that I was lying on her father's cement slab, four-poster bed in his gloomy museum of a bedroom, and that I was fully dressed apart from my shoes. I sat up. I could see myself in a blotchy mirror on the opposite side of the room. My hair was sticking up like Erskine the Mad, and my left cheek was embossed with oriental patterns from the cushion that I had used as a pillow. There was a hole in my fawn-colored sock, and my big toe was sticking out of it. "What time is it?" I asked her. 6. 6? Oh, wonderful. Almost 3.5 hours sleep. "Yes, but now the sun is bright, we can begin to search for the strigoi." It was the crack of dawn, and she wanted to go looking for strigoi. She placed a glass on the table beside me. "Would you like breakfast?" she asked me. "I have yogurt and honey and farina with dried apricots." "Oh, no, I'm fine, thanks. I make it a rule not to put anything solid into my mouth until I'm officially awake, and I am not usually officially awake until noon." I picked up the glass and took a sip of tea. I'm not a tea person, as a rule. As far as I'm concerned, a drink should A, wake you up, or B, nourish you, or C, knock you unconscious, which is why I stick to strong black coffee and Guinness and Jack Daniels. Tea is just leafy water, and you can find leafy water in the woods. Jenica looked pleased with herself. "I have looked through my father's library and found this book of all the Svorkolaki. It was compiled by a special brotherhood of priests in the late 1700s, the Black Purifiers. In those days, vampires were spreading through Transylvania and Wallachia faster than a plague, and so the bishops of the Romanian Orthodox Church demanded a purge of every Svorkolaki and Strigoi and Moroi. The Black Purifiers searched every cellar and every steeple, and they impaled every vampire they found, or beheaded them, or burned them alive, or else they sealed them up in caskets and sarcophagi. The book has the pictures and names of every known Svorkolaki that they managed to track down." "Well, that's terrific. Maybe you can give me a couple of minutes for my eyes to focus, and then I can take a look at it." "You would like more tea? It is bison grass tea. It is supposed to make men have the more virility." "I hate to be ungrateful," I said, "but do you think there's any chance of some coffee?" "Of course. Wash, and I will make you coffee. I have laid out towels." I limped into the Moorish bathroom and climbed into the shower. It had a baffling array of old-fashioned faucets, and I blasted myself 3 times with freezing cold water before I managed to adjust it to a heavy, tepid downpour, the kind where you have to hold your breath to stop yourself from drowning. I was toweling myself dry when Jenica walked into the bathroom as unself-consciously as if we were married. "You would like cake?" No, just coffee." Always I used to think that it was not really true about the strigoi in New York, even though my father was so sure. Who would believe that it was true? Who would believe that we would have to hunt the strigoi, you and I? "Well, we don't have to hunt them, you know. We could always barricade ourselves in and wait until they've gone away." You are losing your nerve, Mr. Harry? No, of course not. I'm just saying that we're not actually obliged to go out looking for them. Nobody's going to think any less of us if we don't. Jenica shook her head. We will think less of us. Besides, the Strigoi will never go away until they have drunk the last drop of human blood in the city. Then, this will only be a city of the night, and there will be no people here by day. It happened before, in Târgu Mureș, in Romania. It can happen here. The trouble was, I knew she was right. It seemed impossible that the most important city in the United States was being overrun by blood-sucking creatures from the Dark Ages. In fact, it seemed insane. But on September 11th, 2001, New York's 2 tallest buildings had been brought down by a handful of nut jobs armed with nothing more than box cutters, and more than 3,000 of its citizens killed. And on the evening of September 10th, who could have imagined anything more insane than that? It's always hard to believe that anybody can hate you that much, for no reason at all. Once I was dressed, I went through to the living room and found Jenica poring through her father's book. It was a very thin book, bound in cracked tan leather that had the texture of dried human skin, with some kind of mystic symbol on the front, an oval with an eye in the middle. On each page there was a finely rendered woodcut of a man's face, and a few paragraphs of dense handwritten text. "Here is your coffee," said Jenica, and passed me a tiny blue porcelain cup that she must have burgled from a doll's house. I peered into it, and it was only a third full, but it had a rich, nutty aroma, and when I tipped it back and swallowed it, I felt as if I had instantly grown a thick, black beard, and I was quite surprised when I didn't start talking like James Earl Jones. "Perhaps soon your singing rock will give you the name of your vampire gatherer," said Jenica. "I guess I could try asking him, although I doubt if he will. I think there's a strong possibility that he might have given it to me already, and I just haven't realized it, and he's kind of huffy about doing things twice." Jenica said, "It is most important for us to have this name. We need to know which of the Svarkolaki we are looking for, because a different ritual is necessary to dismiss each one of them. This ritual is what you would call the disenchantment, and it is supposed to force the Svarkolaki to return to their coffins and to seal them up until they are summoned again." I peered at the page she was pointing at, although I couldn't understand any of the words, let alone pronounce them. Si Dracul Ku Draco Aiki. Never mind. But then I looked more closely at the woodcut. It depicted a man smiling, with his eyes closed. Around his face was a decorative border of toads and dragonflies and tiny flowers. Although the man's face was different and the border was different, the design bore a strikingly close resemblance to the medallion that I had taken from Ted Bush. I wedged my hand into my back pants pocket and dragged the medallion out. "Here," I told Jenica, holding it up. "I took this from the young guy I was telling you about last night." Jenica held it in her hand and peered at it closely. Then she looked at me with those dark liquid eyes as if I was the village idiot. "Why did you not show this to me before?" she demanded. "I don't know. I forgot about it." "How could you forget about it? This is one of the Svarkolaki." "Well, I know that now." She turned it over. "The inscription on the back, this is a kind of protection. From vampires and from a home with vampires, from those who cast the evil eye, keep me safe." The poor guy said it was given to him by a Russian-looking girl. Said Jenica dismissively. I would be sure that she was Romanian, probably, and she was the Strigoica who infected him. You see, she would have given him the medallion to keep him safe from other vampires who wanted to cut his throat and drink his blood. She must have liked him and wanted him to become Strigoi like her, one of her lovers. How about the face? We have to look through the book. I stood close beside her as she carefully turned each page. There were over 80 Svarkalaki, and most of them were very similar, handsome in a Slavic way, thin-faced and pointy-nosed, although some were very swarthy-looking and some were sporting huge mustaches and enormous beards. Maybe they'd been drinking Jenika's coffee. Each Svarkalaki, however, had a different decorative border drawn around his face, everything from songbirds to razors to mulberry leaves. "Here," said Jenika suddenly, "this, I am thinking, is our vampire gatherer." I was thinking that she was right. The man in the woodcut was wearing a striped turban wound around his head and one elaborate earring, but it was definitely the same man whose likeness was embossed on Ted Bush's medallion. The border was the same too, snakes intertwined with each other, and stars. His expression was grim, as if he were seriously pissed that we had discovered him. The name below the picture was Vasile Loop. Jenika immediately covered it with her hand and said, "Do not read this out loud. This could be the name that your spirit guide was warning you about." "My lips are sealed, believe me." Jenika took her hand away and began to translate. "His name means the wolf. It says here that he was a cousin of Vlad Tepes, known as Vlad the Impaler, or Dracula." "You're kidding me. Dracula, as in Dracula?" "Well, of course, but Dracula himself was only a man of very extreme cruelty, the voyevode of Wallachia." "The what? Of where?" "He was like a prince in the southern part of Romania, but he was never a vampire." "But this guy was?" "That's right." Jenika's fingers traced along the thick black lines of Romanian script. "It says here, late in September 1457, when he was hunting in the mountains for wild boar, well, I shall say the wolf each time instead of his real name. The wolf became hopelessly lost, and he was forced to spend several nights sleeping in the forest. Each night, as soon as it grew dark, he was approached by swarms of Strigwoika. These were the female vampires who were always looking for male lovers so that they could turn them into Strigoi. There were too many Strigwoika, and the wolf's efforts to keep them at bay were hopeless. He became one of the undead himself. When he eventually found his way back to Dracula's castle, he would say nothing of what had happened to him, although after his return from the forest, he was never seen abroad during the day, and he became very secretive in his behavior. Well, that doesn't surprise me. I think I'd be pretty secretive if I was dead." Jenika frowned at me. She was so serious about all of this Strigoi stuff that it was hard not to believe that it was all true, even though, hello, we were talking about Dracula here, and real live dead people who were 5.5 centuries old. The wolf began to gather around him some of Dracula's many disaffected courtiers with the intention of assassinating Dracula and taking over as voyevode. In those days, you see, assassination was the usual way to seize power, even amongst sons and brothers. But Dracula had many spies and discovered what the wolf was plotting. When the wolf was dragged from his bed and exposed to daylight, Dracula immediately realized that he was one of the undead. He ordered him to be impaled on a high pole, which was the usual way in which he dealt with traitors and liars and people who displeased him. On one occasion, Dracula had impaled 3,000 people in a single day. The pole was blunt and very well oiled, so that the wolf would not immediately die of shock, and it was pushed into the wolf's buttocks until it came out of his mouth. It was then erected in the shadow of the castle walls, so that the wolf would not be incinerated by the rays of the sun, and would suffer great agony for days on end. Jenica turned the page. However, Dracula's mistress, Lenuta, who had once been the wolf's wife and had been forcibly taken by Dracula, took pity on him. She shone her hand mirror from the battlements so that the rays of the sun set him on fire and cremated him to ashes, and so delivered him from his pain. The wolf thus became a dead vampire, or a svarkolaki. Dracula discovered what his mistress had done and had her stomach cut open so that everybody could see where he had been. The wolf had to wait many years to take his revenge on Dracula, but eventually he did so. On the second night of the Battle of Bucharest, in December 1476, 5 Strigoi entered Dracula's tent. They slit his throat and drank his blood, and then they cut off his head and mounted it on a pole, so that the victorious Turks would discover it in the morning when the sun rose. Well, that's not exactly bedtime reading, is it? Does it say how the wolf was caught by the priests? Only briefly, said Jenica. In 1767, the black purifiers tracked down the wolf and his nest of strigoi to a house near Borsa in Transylvania. The priests diverted a stream so that the house was surrounded on all sides by running water, which vampires are unable to cross, and then they tore the house down so that the vampires were exposed to sunlight. The wolf, of course, could not be killed, but it says here that he was wound around with a mile of silver wire, and then he was shut up in an iron casket lined with silver, which was sealed with wax made from melted church candles mixed with crushed garlic. Or rather, Jenica frowned and read the words again. Something wrong? I asked her. I do not completely understand this. It does not exactly say that the wolf himself was bound with silver wire and shut up in a silver-lined casket. If you translate the words literally, they mean his perfect picture, or maybe his exact likeness would be more accurate. Well, I suggested, he was a spirit, wasn't he? Rather than a walking dead person, and spirits can assume all kinds of really strange shapes. When Singing Rock brought him into my apartment, he was all stretched out, more like a shadow than a person. Maybe the priests were trying to say that whatever shape he was, it was definitely him, his exact likeness. I'm still not sure, said Jenica. But anyway, the casket was taken to Borsa and bricked up in the vaults of the chapel of St. Basil, and that must have been where Georges Vlad found it. So this is the vampire gatherer we have to go looking for? That's right, although I do not know how we are going to find him. The Svarkolaki are notorious for concealing themselves so that not even the most skillful purifiers can discover their hiding places. Well, maybe I should try saying the wolf's real name. That way he'd come looking for me. No, you do not know what you are suggesting, Mr. Harry. If the Svarkolaki becomes aware that you are hunting for him, he will always make sure that you are dead before the next sun rises. And yes, your spirit guide is right. You will be ripped to pieces so that there is nothing left to bury of you but human rags. Okay then, I said. So what's plan B? I will look through my father's books and see if I can discover how it was that the black purifiers discovered where the wolf was hiding. Well, that's a good idea. You're not just an extraordinary-looking woman, are you? She stared at me as if she were waiting for me to say something else. What do you want me to tell you? I said. I think you're beautiful, and if you don't know that you're beautiful, then you've been looking in the wrong mirrors. Mr. Harry, We are looking for a vampire gatherer. Yes, I'm sorry, but I just thought I'd let you know that I'm not completely impervious, to the way you look. And that tickly thing you did on the palm of my hand. And, well, you walked into the bathroom, didn't you? And I was taking a shower. Jenica looked totally baffled. You can't even imagine how relieved I was when the doorbell rang. Well, thank you for listening to this week's episode. And I hope you'll join us next week for another installment of Manitou Blood. And until then, I hope you all have a wonderful New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. And I look forward to seeing you all in the new year.